You're listening to Nightlight Radio Network. This is Dr. Bob Hieronimus, co-host of 21st Century Radio. We are happy to present this rebroadcast of our show on Nightlight. For nearly 25 years of 21st Century Radio, UFOs have been a major topic. But, as you know, we have many major topics. If you want to spend a little time at the beach or in your yard or in bed for late night reading, this is the book on UFOs that you will enjoy the most. It's called UFOs in Wartime, What They Didn't Want You to Know by Mack Maloney. Accounts of hovering objects when war is imminent reach as far back as 312 AD. When seen by Roman Emperor Constantine, remember we talked about him just a couple of weeks ago, Constantine I, as he led his troops into battle. They supposedly aided George Washington in winning the American Revolution. Boy, I hope they really did, because I really don't know if that's true. UFOs were also reported flying over Normandy on D-Day and were dubbed Foo Fighters by World War II pilots. In Vietnam, an Air Force commander said they were plagued by UFOs. Even today, the reports continue to pour in as noiseless objects are seen darting over the battlegrounds of the Middle East. Now, these sightings, as inconceivable as they may seem, are made by soldiers, officials, news reporters. Why did these reports spike so drastically during wartime? Could it be mistaken aircraft, or is it someone or something looking in on us? Mack Maloney grew up in Dorchester section of Boston. His father was a veteran of World War II and was an avid reader of military books. As a child, Mack started reading them as well, along with a lot of science fiction. He received a B.S. in journalism and a graduate degree in filmmaking from Emerson College. He was a sports reporter for 2 years after college, before joining corporate America as a publicist for General Electric Company. Mack started writing books in 1984 and has been doing it full-time since 1987, penning over 30 books. Yay! Way to go, Mack! Mack, how are you?
I'm doing good, Bob. How are you doing?
Now, how's your pitching arm? You still got a good curveball?
No, that went away about 10 years ago.
Mine, I never had mine. I always tried to have a slider and a knuckleball, and I couldn't have those either. Well,
I didn't have either of those either.
Well, I guess that's the reason why I was 0-75, and then I had to give up. Well, can you give examples of wartime UFOs made before the 20th century?
Yes. Well, we have, in the book, we have about 70 episodes of military encounters with UFOs, and the first one we found was in around 300 BC, when Alexander the Great was in the process of conquering the known world, and he had come to a strategic river crossing in East Persia, and he had a large army, a lot of cavalry, a lot of foot soldiers, but also war elephants. And as he was about to go over this river, his historians traveling with him reported that these flying shields showed up out of the sky and started buzzing his army and frightened his war elephants and the cavalry horses to the point where they would not cross the river. So that's like the earliest example that we've had of a military encounter with UFOs. Oddly enough, 2 years later, Alexander the Great was laying siege to the city of Tyre, which is in Lebanon, and is actually a city that was built in a harbor off the coast of Lebanon. And he had laid siege to it for about a year, and his troops were building causeways across the harbor so they could attack the city. And as the story goes, these flying shields showed up again, and this time they seemed to be on Alexander's side, because the story says that one of them shot some kind of a beam or whatever at one of the walls of the city, and knocking it down and allowing Alexander's troops to go in and finally take over the city. So, as I said, that's really the earliest story that we could get, that we found having to do with military encounters and UFOs. Well,
I sure did love the account of 134 A.D. or 1034 AD. I'm sorry about that, because it's my favorite. Ufologist is Jacques Vallée. My favorite shape is a cigar-shaped object.
Mm-hmm.
They're very, very popular, aren't they?
I think that they are the most commonly reported UFO shape, and that the saucer shape is the second most. But oddly enough, the cigar-shaped object is what most people see.
Well, I like them so much. In my first mural I did at Johns Hopkins University, I put several of them in the mural. Well, in Baltimore they're pronounced muriels, because I think it mainly was because of their shape. That is, I like a good cigar every now and then, and I like the ones especially that had little portholes, and I made sure I put a few with portholes in them. Well, I loved your book. I mean, I think I've read about 424 million UFO books, and this book is truly enjoyable. You do a lot of important research in here that others haven't, and we'll touch on some of that a little later on. But especially, here's one that I really wish were true, the one with George Washington. Can you tell us a little bit about this, please?
Well, I should preface it by saying that when we were researching the book, we probably came up with about 200 candidate stories, let's say, and we had to pare them down to the 70 that finally lined up in the book. But there were a handful of stories that I can only describe them as just being too good not to include.
Yeah.
And this is one of them.
Sure.
We found documentation or other writings that said that when George Washington was at Valley Forge at the lowest point of the Revolutionary War, that he and his men were befriended by what they thought was a tribe of Native Americans who they called the Greenskins. And these people gave them food and ammunition and wood for their fires. They also gave them some sort of military intelligence on the British and the Hessians who were in the area. And they were said to have lived in a lodge that was saucer-shaped and that was sometimes there and sometimes not there. Mm-hmm. So from, those reports, some people have speculated that these greenskins might have been ETs or occupants of the UFO who were on the scene helping Washington, in as I say, in the worst part of the Revolution.
Yeah, well, Ancient Aliens did a little story on that, but I think your information in your book on page 11, etc., they should have called you. They should have, because every now and then, shows that especially television shows that put a great deal of emphasis upon highly emotional stuff is fine, but they need to do better research into this area here. I think I'd love for that story to be true. I really would.
True.
But I don't know. I'm it's not that I'm always skeptical, but I'm always skeptical about certain things about the Founding Fathers because so much has been written about them that is so inaccurate. Okay, now you have a chapter on spaceships, or scare ships, you call them, of 1909 that includes an early Men in Black story. Can you give us some details on this, please?
Well, the scare ships were aerial vehicles that people were seeing in the east of England in 1909. They were shaped like Zeppelins. They were the size of Zeppelins, but they weren't Zeppelins because, for one thing, the Germans, even though they had just invented the Zeppelin, they did not have a Zeppelin that could make the 700 or 900-mile round trip from Germany to England in 1909. Also, people were seeing these things in the early spring of 1909, which means that it would be very cold flying weather. And also, people who saw these scare ships, actually clocked them at going more than 200, 250 miles an hour. And even these days, our most modern blimps can only do about 50 or 60 miles an hour. So people started seeing these scare ships. They were dubbed scare ships by the British press. They were seeing them all over the place in the spring of 1909. And there was more than one because people would see more than one. And these reports were all over England and even as far away as Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
And in one of the cases, a gentleman had seen a scare ship go over his house. He lived in a house on a cliff right on the English Channel. And a scare ship had gone over his house the night before. Lots of people saw it. The next morning, he found this very odd object out on his cliff, let's say, and he described it as a soccer ball with a metal rod running through it.
Hmm.
No one had any idea what this thing was. The local police had no idea what it was. The Coast Guard had no idea what it was. So he was told to hang on to it until the British military could come and collect it. In that time, he was away one day, and his maid was leaving to go somewhere, and she noticed these two men dressed in black who were kind of snooping around his property, and they were looking in the area where this weird object had been found. They had stored the object in his barn, but the British military had picked it up by this time. But these two guys in black were looking in his barn as well. And when she saw them and they saw her, they kind of both ran off in different directions. But after that, people started reporting that anytime these scare ships would show up, the next morning they would see these people dressed in black, hanging around, kind of looking around. Maybe investigating what might have fallen out of these things or what might have happened, when they went over. So it actually turns out to be, the earliest recorded instance that I could find of a Men in Black episode.
Mm-hmm. What do you really personally think about Men in Black? Who do you think they are?
Well, I wish I knew.
Well, could you speculate? Because one of the good things about your work is, you've read so widely and deeply in these areas, so your speculation has great value.
If I had to guess, I would say that they are probably government agents, even though I've read and seen descriptions of them, kind of being these not quite human characters. I could see parts of the government having these plans to come and talk to people to kind of ward them off talking about UFOs, or actually scare them or intimidate them about talking about UFOs. I mean, there's certain instances where government agencies do that all the time. So I think that there's a chance that, as far as in the United States anyway, that they could be government agents. But again, like I said, I'd love to know, because there's been reports of Men in Black. Well, here we have this one going back to 1909, and other reports of them, and popping up in other places. So, maybe they do have some kind of a otherworldly origin. Yeah,
that is fascinating. It really is. I was just trying to recall one of Charles Fort. Do you remember what he thought about them?
I don't know, really.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, I think he was the most unusual UFO researcher, if you would. I don't think necessarily he thought they were just extraterrestrial, though, but that's something else altogether. Now, what kind of UFO sightings took place during World War I? This one includes, as you note here, the first man to shoot at a UFO while in flight.
Well, what happened was, in 1914, by that time the Germans had perfected the Zeppelins, and the Zeppelins would come over England and really were the first aerial bombers. They would bomb British cities. But at the time, the British had not figured out a way to combat them. Later on, they would invent the incendiary bullet, which would be fired at Zeppelins, would catch the gas within the Zeppelin's bag on fire, and the Zeppelins would blow up. But at this point, in 1914, they didn't have that type of technology. So what they used to do is they would send airplanes up over major British cities at night to serve as kind of a crude early warning system, that these pilots, would see the Zeppelins coming from, a distance farther off than if someone on the ground was looking for them. And that's what this one pilot was doing one night over London, and he in January, and he came upon this aerial object that he thought was a Zeppelin, but he actually described it as looking like a railway car. With windows and lights behind the windows and so on. So the only thing he was armed with was his pistol, and he pulled out the pistol and started firing at this thing. As soon as he did that, it took off at tremendous speed, and it took off at such speed that he thought that he was actually crashing, and he actually did crash into a marsh. He destroyed his plane, but he survived. But as far as we could figure out, that's the first time anyone shot at a UFO in flight.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to take our first break of this hour. Our guest is Mack Maloney, UFOs in Wartime, What They Didn't Want You to Know.
This is Dr. Jacques Vallée. You're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus, the reference in the study of the paranormal.
Oh, gosh, we just heard from Jacques just a little while ago. And okay, our guest is Mack Maloney, UFOs in Wartime, What They Didn't Want You to Know, Berkeley Publishing, MackMaloney.com, and it's linked on the front page of 21stCenturyRadio.com. I wanted to read something here. This is what he notes. UFOs are real simply by the sheer number of sightings made by military personnel during times of conflict. These people are in the middle of combat. They're not about to be making up a story or having a hallucination or perpetuating a hoax. Often they are fighting for their lives when they make these observations. In this way, they are the best witnesses. We have trained pilots, sailors, and soldiers, both officers, enlisted personnel, etc., etc., etc. Thank you for that statement, Mack. Because so many there have been in the past, especially with PsyCop, who were putting down anyone who reported a UFO, especially if they were an astronaut or served in the military.
Right.
It was terrible. You know what they said about the astronauts? Well, he's just a space jockey. What does he know? Jeez, whiz. Well, okay, I'm sorry. I'm so proud of you for saying that, and thank you for your focusing on those who have served our nation. It's extremely important, especially today. Well, the next area that I want to touch on is concerning ghost flyers in 1934. Were you born in 1934?
I was not, no.
No, okay.
This is actually probably my favorite chapter of the book because it's just so strange.
It is.
In 1934, actually the end of 1933, in a very remote section of Sweden, up near the Arctic Circle, this place called Verstabaden, people started seeing these very unusual airplanes. They were very large. They had 8 engines, and there was no airplanes flying at that time that had 8 engines. They had a twin beam tail section similar to a P-38 Lightning of World War II, and they had pontoons. And they were very loud, and they had searchlights attached to the underneath of their fuselage, which these very powerful beams would shoot down to the ground. So people started seeing these things in December 33, and then throughout the winter of 34, and of course in that part of the world, during the winter it's nighttime just about all the time, and they were seen doing very unusual things. They would make a lot of noise. They would circle villages or railway stations or mountains endlessly all night long, just circling. People would be out in the streets looking at these airplanes, just endlessly circling villages. And, of course, even these days it would be hard to get an airplane to be able to circle anything or stay airborne for, 8 to 10 hours because you have to refuel. But for whatever reason, these airplanes didn't seem in need of refueling, or not very often. People saw them flying in formation. There was lots of them. The Swedish military sent up airplanes to try to intercept them, and were never able to do that. People in Finland and Norway saw them as well. There was speculation that maybe these were German aircraft being launched from an aircraft carrier up in the Arctic Sea or something, but that couldn't have happened because the Germans never had an aircraft carrier. And even if they had some kind of a ship that was able to launch these huge aircraft, just to do that in the middle of the night, in the middle of some of the worst weather conditions in the world, we'd be hard pressed to do that these days. Never mind back in 1933 when aircraft, air flight was actually in its infancy almost.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it was some kind of a German ship, it would have had to come back to get restocked in Germany, and there would have been a break in these things, seeing these things, but there wasn't. They were seen steadily throughout the winter and early spring of 1934. So, and then they just went away, and no one knows what they were. No one has ever come forward to say, I was one of the ghost flyers, or the planes came from here or there, or we don't know where. It's just a mystery what these things were, and no one has ever been able to figure it out.
That is some serious mystery. 8 engines. 8
Right.
engines. Jeez, a whiz, Mack. Wow, that must have been a huge, huge plane.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I thank you for educating me in that particular area. Our listeners are going to be educated all over the place in this work because of the depth in which you go. And I think you write so credible and so well at the same time. Well, after 30 books, I guess you got the hang of it, right?
Well, the funny thing is that this is my first nonfiction book in almost 25 years.
Oh.
All my other books have been military fiction books and some science fiction. So, when the idea for this came up, I was just at lunch with my editor one day, and we were talking about how I always had this interest in UFOs and military history, and how they just kind of combined at one point. And I just got to thinking, it seems like UFOs show up more in times of wartime than not. And I was thinking, is it because there's more airplanes up there, more opportunity to see UFOs or whatever? But anyway, he said, that might be a good idea for a book, but it would have to be a nonfiction book. Would you want to do that? So I said, sure, why not? And that's really how it all started. It's been interesting doing nonfiction. It's more research. It took longer, but it was also a lot of fun to do.
Well, you write so well, it makes it even much more fun. I think that's really a reason why I could see myself, even though I've read your book twice, and you should I'm going to hold my book up to the microphone right here, and take a look at these pages. See all those pages? Every page is messed up. I've written all over it. It's become I have now a kind of an encyclopedia of your book. Because there are so many important things in here. Now, your book goes into detail about the infamous 1942 UFO over Los Angeles episode, in which many people believe the city was attacked by UFOs. What do you think really happened?
Well, again, it's really kind of hard to figure out. I mean, the short version is that on the late night of February 24th and early morning February 25th, in 1942, over Los Angeles, the Naval Intelligence had told the people there was a lot of military in Los Angeles, a lot of civil defense people, because there was a lot of defense plants in Los Angeles, and so and there was a lot of anti-aircraft batteries and things of that nature there too. So Naval Intelligence told them that they suspected that the Japanese were going to bomb Los Angeles that night, and we were still having war jitters because Pearl Harbor had just happened about 2 months before. The day before, a Japanese submarine had surfaced off a small town about 90 miles north of Los Angeles and fired on an oil refinery there. So people were sure the Japanese were in the area, but sure enough, early in the morning of the 25th, these things started showing up on radar. There were lots of them. They blew the air raid siren, and at the time, L.A. had up 2 million citizens, and they figured at least half of them must have woken up and seen these things. Lots of newspaper reporters. They had 7 newspapers in Los Angeles at the time. They had reporters everywhere. Lots of them were on buildings with military people or with law enforcement people, and they just saw these things over Los Angeles. And they were round. They were shaped like saucers. They were flying in chevron formation. The anti-aircraft batteries opened up on them and kept firing for 2.5 hours. So many anti-aircraft shells were fired at these things that when anti-aircraft shells explode and they don't hit anything, they come back down as shrapnel, and they killed 6 people on the ground, did a lot of property damage, and people saw these anti-aircraft shells bursting on these things and having no effect on them. So the culmination of all this was that the Los Angeles Times photographer took a picture, which might be the best UFO picture ever taken, of one of these things caught in searchlights being fired at by anti-aircraft guns. over Los Angeles. And the LA Times gave us permission to run that picture in the book. The next day, the UFOs finally went away. The next day, the Army and the Navy were at each other's throats trying to come up with some kind of an explanation of what had happened. The Navy said nothing happened, that this was total war jitters, but the Army said, no, this was impossible. At the time, the Army was the Air Force as well. They saw these things on radar, and so many people saw them on the ground. They floated a story that they were actually airliners disguised. Japanese had disguised airliners as bombers as airliners and had taken off from a secret base in Mexico, which was, ludicrous. And then the next day, the war censors just put a clamp down on all information about this, and it basically went away because we had a war to fight. Exactly what happened, who knows? There's never been any kind of official government investigation into what happened, or at least one that was made public. We have that photograph. We have lots of people who saw these things over Los Angeles, but, what they were, impossible to say.
It looks like you have an entire page from the Los Angeles Times. Was that the entire page?
That's the entire page. That's right. Yep.
That's terrific. That's terrific. Because I've seen the other photograph before, but there's 7 other photographs of people pointing things, holding things that fell from the shrapnel and stuff like that. So congratulations on putting the whole thing in there rather than just a photo. That's the kind of thing I think is really important to educate people in this particular area. The problem is we need 4 hours to do this book because there are so many good chapters that we're not going to even have time to touch on. One, of course, is the Foo Fighters sightings in World War II, and whether or not they were Germans or Japanese. What did they know about them? What about people who contend Foo Fighters were secret Nazi super weapons? You go through all of this in great detail, and it's very credible. Now, there is one thing we really need to talk about that all of my friends who are UFO researchers are going to beat me up if I utter your perspective on Roswell, but I think it's an important perspective. What do you believe happened in Roswell?
Well, I don't think anything happened at Roswell. As I said before, I read lots of UFO books as a kid. Every UFO book I could get my hands on, I read. And you didn't start hearing about Roswell until the late 70s or early 80s, when it was kind of brought back to the forefront to the National Enquirer and other means. And if you just go and look at the photographs, for instance, I was just watching something on TV, like on the Discovery Channel one night, and this is even before we started the book, and they just laid out the photograph of the debris that the Air Force said that they found, and also the debris from one of these spy balloons that they were launching in the area at the time. They were launching these balloons to float over the Soviet Union with acoustic devices in them to see if they could pick up any evidence that the Russians were working on an atomic bomb. And they just kind of fit these two things together. And if you see it, it just, you can see that what they found in the field, or what's in that photograph, is the wreckage from the kite of one of these spy balloons. So I wanted to believe in Roswell. In fact, at one point in the 80s, they were going to send an archaeological team down there to do a dig in the debris field, and I volunteered to go because I wanted so much to believe in it. But just the more I looked into it, the more I saw of these things, and then more books have come out, and now I think that, the count is up to, there was 12 discs that had crashed there, and dozens of bodies, and, the military, silencing people and everything. And to me, it's just like too many moving parts to this story. Why would all these UFOs crash at Roswell? So I just think that there's just a lot of impossibilities into the current Roswell story. And I'm not saying that there hasn't been other discs found in other places and recovered by the U.S. military and they're hiding them, but I just don't think it happened at Roswell. I would like to, I'd like someone to change my mind, but right now I don't think anything happened there.
Well, when we get back, because we're going to take a break here, we have to talk about the Maury Island incident. You do it at length. Thank heavens you do it at length, because there's a lot of abbreviated stories about this. The Maury Island incident. You want to study up on that before we come back?
Yes.
Good. All right. As if you don't know it by heart, right? Okay. Our guest is Mack Maloney. UFOs in Wartime. What they didn't want you to know. Now, okay, Maury Island. Oh, I've been looking forward to reading more and more about this particular. Tell us about the Maury Island incident.
Well, it began in the summer of 1947, and it happened right after Kenneth Arnold had his famous, quote-unquote, flying saucers sighting. I'm sure people know that story. He was the first person to, after seeing strange things in the sky that couldn't be identified, he told the press that they looked like saucers skipping across a pond, and from that the media created the name Flying Saucers. So, and he was just a businessman who happened to be flying his private plane that day. But what happened was, actually 3 or 4 days before that, there was a gentleman named Harold Dow, and he had a business in Tacoma, Washington, where he would go out in a boat with some crew members, and they would pick up trees that had been cut down by logging companies that somehow got into the water and got away from them. And his company, what they used to do is they'd retrieve these trees and bring them back to the lumber company so they could be harvested and so on. So he was out there one day off of an island in near Tacoma, Washington, called Maury Island. And they saw, his son, and 2 crew members were on the boat and saw these handful of UFOs suddenly appear above them. They looked like large donuts. And they could see lights spinning around on the outside and on the inside of them. And they would just, at first they thought they were balloons, but the longer they had these things in sight, they realized that these things were things that they had never seen before. So as they watched, they saw that one of these UFOs seemed to be having some kind of technical difficulty, seemed to be faltering, and all this was happening right over their boat. And at one point, one of the other UFOs came up to this disabled UFO, let's say, and seemed to send an electrical charge into it. When this happened, the stricken UFO expelled tons of this material, which they described as slag, into the water and onto the coast of Maury Island. Now, while this was happening, Dow beached his boat on Maury Island, and he and the crew took cover from this slag that was falling out of the sky, and actually it injured his son and killed the dog that they had with him. So they watched this fantastic scene going on, and finally the disabled UFO seemed to regain power, and together they all just shot off at tremendous speed, and they were gone in the blink of an eye. So Dow and his crew were, very, shocked, let's say, and they got back in their boat, went back to Tacoma, and he got medical treatment for his son. And they also vowed not to talk to anyone about this. Now, the next morning, a man came to Dow's house, and Dow at first thought that he was an insurance salesman, and he said, "I would like to talk to you," so they went to breakfast. As they're having breakfast, this gentleman, who was dressed in black, started to recount a lot of things that Dow had seen over Maury Island the day before, almost as if this guy was there or intimately knew the details of it. And he warned Dow that if he told anyone about this, that bad luck would come to him, to his family, so on and so forth, and really threatened him into being silent. Dow went to work later on that day and decided not to, keep quiet about it, and he told the whole story to his boss, a gentleman named Fred Crispin. Now, Crispin's name is going to be important at the end of the story. Anyway, Crispin went out to Maury Island later on, and he, too, he said he also saw UFOs there. So now they had both sighted these things, and they wrote to a science fiction magazine in Chicago about what had happened. Now, this is all just in the same time frame as Kenneth Arnold had seen his UFOs, his flying saucers. And the science fiction magazine decided to do a story on this. And who did they send out to Tacoma to do the story but Kenneth Arnold, the guy who had seen the first quote-unquote flying saucers? Even though he wasn't a journalist, the magazine thought he would be a good pick to do the story. So Dow and Crispin and Kenneth Arnold get into a hotel room, and Kenneth Arnold starts to interview them. as he's doing this, the phone rings, and it's a newspaper man from Tacoma newspaper, and he's saying, I don't really know who you gentlemen are or what you're doing there, but I have someone on the other line who is telling me every word that is being said in your hotel room.
Oh.
So Kenneth Arnold and the other two are, very surprised to hear this, and they sweep the room for bugs, electronic bugs, listening devices. They can't find any. But at that point, Kenneth Arnold decided that they should get the military involved. And he had some contacts in the military that he had met since his sighting of the flying saucers. So he made some phone calls, and the next day, two Air Force pilots, intelligence officers, flew up in a B-25 bomber from California to Tacoma to talk to Dow and Chrisman and Kenneth Arnold. They landed in Tacoma, went to the hotel room, and now the five of them are in the hotel room, and they're talking about what happened. They have some of the slag with them, and wouldn't you know, the newspaper reporter calls up again and says the same thing. I can hear everything that's going on inside that hotel room. It was like someone was able to listen in on them. At that point, the military men thought, okay, this is a little too strange for us. We're going to get out of here. They took a sample of the slag, went back to the airport, had a brief session with the air base's intelligence officer, then got on the plane to fly back to California, and within a half hour, those two men were dead because their plane crashed very close to where Kenneth Arnold saw his flying saucers. Well, at that point, and when Kenneth Arnold found out about this, he thought, this is just getting too strange for me. So he called up the magazine editor in Chicago, said, I'm off the job, I'm not a journalist, I don't want to be involved in this anymore. He got back in his plane and took off, and it turns out that there was something wrong with his plane, and he almost crashed. Luckily, he was such an accomplished pilot, he was able to land, and something had gone wrong with his engine, something very unusual. So the FBI got involved in this, and even though a lot of people accused Dahl and Chrisman as coming up with this hoax, the FBI, later on, there's cables that we found in the research where J. Edgar Hoover was sure that this was not a hoax. His FBI agents in Tacoma assured him this was not a hoax, that Chrisman and Dow believed in what they were saying. And odd things did happen to Dow. His wife got very sick. He had marriage problems with her. The son disappeared, showed up in Nebraska, couldn't remember how he got there. All this really weird stuff started happening. And some people who've looked into it think that this could be some kind of a counterintelligence operation. If you peel away a couple of the onion layers, it looks like there might be something like that going on. Other people have no idea what had happened and still don't. Yeah. But the strange thing is Kenneth Arnold went on to talk about this, later on in life. But the very odd thing is Fred Chrisman, Dow's boss, was actually called before a committee years later investigating the JFK assassination. Because people who know about that assassination know that right after it happened, the police picked up 3 hobos on a railroad track nearby the assassination spot, and one of them had Fred Chrisman's name in his pant pocket. So what all this means, no one has ever been able to figure out, but it's a very strange story.
It sure is, and thank you for doing such a good job on that one. A lot of people didn't go deep enough to. Now, we just got a few minutes left, and there are so many important topics in here, but I got to go to, first, by the way, let me jump ahead near the end of your book, and where you ask, basically, don't put the U.S. military in charge of this type of research because we've run into some enormous problems because of that. So I wanted to make that point that you make throughout your work. But also, let's finish up with the UFO incursions of U.S. IBM bases in the 60s and the 70s.
Well, that's another story that not many people, really realize happened. I mean, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 where, U.S. and Russia almost went to war because of putting nuclear missiles in Cuba. But just as soon as that was settled, we started putting ICBM missiles into silos in the middle part of the U.S., and as soon as this started happening, people started seeing UFOs appearing over these bases. And for the next 15 years or so, or actually it's supposedly still going on today, but it was very heavy in the 60s and the 70s, UFOs would show up over these bases with some frequency, And they would typically what would happen is the UFO would come over. These silos were spread out all over the prairie, miles apart, and they would hover over a silo, and something in the missile that was waiting on the ground, something would go wrong. Either the power would go off, or the targeting system was skewed, or sometimes they would lose all information having to do with the launch codes, things like that. And there were instances where UFOs just would, in one night would go over 150 silos, and each one of them would lose power, then the UFO would move on, and the power would come back on. Dozens of people saw these things, probably hundreds. The U.S. Air Force completely denied everything. They would happen at places nuclear bases up in Maine, all the way across the country to Colorado in the same night. Mm-hmm. And the U.S. military looked into it very deeply. There's a 170-page report that they put out on it, but at the last minute, instead of using the words UFOs, they blacked it out and put in black helicopters, unknown helicopters. So they know more about this than they're letting on. As I said, I've heard lately that, it's still going on. Robert Hastings wrote a book called UFOs and Nukes, which is the Bible on this thing. Very, very scary situation that UFOs might have some kind of control over our nuclear forces.
And, of course, we basically have been told time and again that they really, UFOs have really do not cause any threat. I believe they're tinkering around with our ICBMs could be interpreted as a possible threat. Do you?
A threat, or they're trying to send us a message. Mm-hmm. I mean, the message being, and this has happened with Russian ICBMs as well, the message being is that, we can control these things. Mm-hmm. Not just you. We can control them. We can shut them off. We can retarget your missiles. So, I think they're trying to give us a message, and I think the message is that you better watch what you do with these things.
Sure, and I think we better watch what we do with these things. So, when do you think the government will come clean and tell us that, there might be a UFO or two somewhere?
I don't think they'll ever come clean. I think that what's going to solve the UFO puzzle is that at some point, maybe in the next 2 or 3 decades, that the scientific community will get to the point where it's no longer considered, foolish to investigate UFOs, and only when the scientific community is given, the okay to look into them and given the funding to look into UFOs, I think that's the only time that will be the first time that we find out exactly what they are. Of course, unless one of them lands on the White House lawn at some point. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's likely. I think that it's going to be the scientists who reveal to us what UFOs are. I think that the military has been covering these things up since 1947 or even earlier. You're never going to get the true story out of the military, I'm sad to say.
Yeah, as you say, the Pentagon cheapened out when it came to studying UFOs. The institute that historically overspends on everything chose to nickel and dime this very important matter. Why? There's only one answer. They did it because they never intended to do a good job in the first place. In fact, the goal all along was to do the worst job possible. Good going, Mack. Great job.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you for joining us on 21st Century Radio, Mack. Please hang on the line when we say goodbye. We'll be right back. 21st Century Radio is produced by Hieronimus and Company. Our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner. Our engineer is Anita Brockington, and I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus.